Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to episode 46 of Buha's Block. On today's episode, I am excited to be joined by Andy Kamenetzky, the handsome half of the Cam brothers. Andy did not text me to say that, just so you know, Brian. But also the host of
You got eyes,
Lakers.
Jovan.
Also the host of Locked On Lakers, and we're doing a home and home this week. Andy, how are you doing? How are you hanging in?
I mean, this offseason in particular has felt like it's been going on a while because there's been really nothing new to talk about. Like, it's just felt like the Lakers are in this state of, I don't want to say purgatory because I think that makes it sound worse than they actually are in, but it's just been this state of limbo or like Groundhog Day. Just ever since they drafted Dalton Connect and Bronny James and re-signed LeBron, re-signed Max Christie, it's just been Lakers are connected to this particular player, and there is some degree of efforting to get that player, and for a variety of reasons, it didn't work out, and here we are.
Here we are. So
waiting for August to roll around, and then September,
and then more of the same.
Yep.
So now that the dust has settled or accumulated, depending on how you look at it, where are you at with the Lakers in terms of how good this roster is, how competitive they can be in a tough Western Conference that continues to get, like I probably would have San Antonio like 11th or 12th, and they could easily win 40 games next season. So it's a brutal Western Conference. But we talked on your show, and I'm not sure on the timing of when the shows are coming out. So I'm just going to stay, like we talked about the Lakers over under of 43.5. And I've talked about, depending on the sports book, you look at 43.5 or 44.5. So where are you at with where they slot in the Western Conference hierarchy? And then also that win total of, the line being basically saying, can the Lakers win 44 or 45 games next season?
I definitely think it's possible they could win 44 or 45. They're in this weird place right now that can be deeply unsatisfying to Laker fans, particularly when you're thinking about, the goal that is always there of trying to win a championship and trying to maximize LeBron and AD together, and the fears that the Russell Westbrook trade and all the time wasted getting out of it and reconfiguring the roster may have ultimately been the time that they needed to maximize most, and maybe that window shut. But the truth is, they won 47 games last year, despite, I know LeBron and AD were healthy for the majority of it, and so were D'Angelo Russell and Austin Reeves, but the absences of Jared Vanderbilt and Gabe Vincent, and I think also the in and out availability of Rui Hachimura in the first half of the year, plus some inexplicable decisions at times by Darvin Ham that I think was in a lot of ways the trickle-down effect of the absences of those guys. Like, I think there is an Earth 2 version last year of the Lakers where Jared Vanderbilt begins the season healthy and he's the starting three, and the team looks a lot more like the one that left off from the Western Conference Finals, and they win 50 games. And even if they lose in the first round just because Denver happens to be a bad matchup for them, there's something psychologically different about 50 wins versus 47. Just it's the next tier of numbers. They're a good team, and I don't think they are necessarily that far off from being great. But the difference between good and great in this Western Conference is tangible. And it's not easy to fix, period. But I think for this particular team with this particular roster, the contracts they have, and also some of the considerations that come with pacing LeBron for 82 games, it's not easy to get to that next level where you feel like they're a championship frontrunner.
I'm glad we are largely in agreement, just because I felt, for the most part, I felt like a lot of people agreed with my last episode on 5 reasons why I think the Lakers will go over their over under. But there are plenty of people disagreeing, and it felt like they were treating it as if I said they're going to win like 60 games and be the 1 seed. It's like, no, I just think if you look at the last couple of years, the way that they closed the 2023 season and then making the conference finals, and then last year, the way that they closed the season, 56 win pace with Rui, or after inserting Rui into the starting lineup. And then running into the buzzsaw that was Denver, but it was close 5 games, a couple of game winners go against them. And maybe that ends up being a 6 or 7 game series, or somehow they they didn't pull it off. But so I just think with JJ Redick coming in and ideally playing the Lakers' best players, and
nice.
Some form of either Rui or Vando starting.
It's my recommendation, JJ. I'm as new as you are, but it's what I would
do. Free consulting.
Yes.
So assuming that Rui or Vando is starting as the 5th starter, either one of those lineups is pretty good and has a pretty good track record. And then having that 6th player come in for either LeBron or for the other forward. And that's a pretty good top 6 that we've seen work over the last season and a half. And then I think we have not really seen Gabe Vincent in his Miami form yet. Max Christie has shown flashes and is now paid as the 8th highest paid player on the team and is making rotation player money. So you got to assume he's going to be in the rotation. Dalton Connect had a really impressive summer league, and I think his ability to move off the ball and be a movement shooter and cutter, and there's different ways the Lakers could use him. So I like that top 9. And of course, the back end of the roster is pretty rough. I think you have as many as 4 guys who I would not want to rely on in a regular season setting under any circumstances. That is a problem when you're looking at some of the other teams in the West. There are teams that I like the Lakers' top 9 better than, but when you start getting into the weeds of the roster, I kind of trust those guys that they have proven veterans or some young guys with upside. Whereas with the Lakers, that there's just a lot of unprovenness at the back end of the roster and rotation. So we'll see with that. But I think clearly at some point the Lakers have to make a move if they are serious about trying to go for it this season and make a run. So with kind of taking a step back and looking at the scope of the offseason, were you surprised that they did not make any move of substance outside of drafting Dalton and Bronny? And where are you at in terms of preaching patience versus the urgency of just maybe it's better to make a move now and go into the season with the new rotation, the new starting lineup, whatever it is, versus rebuilding or restarting, so to speak, around the trade deadline, and then kind of for the second time in 2 years, in 3 years rather, having to sort of reset and figure things out on the fly with a couple months until the playoffs. So in terms of patience versus urgency, where are you at? And then also just the Lakers' lack of they've been active behind the scenes, but actual execution, the inability to execute so far. Have you been surprised by that?
No, in the sense that if you look around the league, at least in my opinion, it's been a pretty quiet offseason period. I don't think there's been a ton of action. It's not like it's felt like half or 3/4 of the league has been really reshuffling their decks in meaningful ways, and the Lakers are the anomaly. It's felt to me for the most part like it's been, compared to other off seasons, relatively quiet. I feel like beyond whatever restrictions the Lakers are working with, I think you get a sense that the new CBA, there are a lot of teams who just want to be a little bit cautious just to see how things play out in the new the apron world, as Rob Pelinka likes to call it, just to see how the mechanics of this really work before they start committing really heavily, unless you're a team like Boston or Phoenix or whatever that's kind of blown past this stuff anyway. So at this point, you just have to maximize where you are. But for example, the Lakers made an attempt to go after Klay Thompson, for example. And to be totally honest, I think they dodged a bullet in terms of reportedly what they would have been paying Klay. And, they obviously would have had to move D'Angelo Russell or Rui or somebody. and somebody would have had to get routed to a third team because Golden State did not want to take on any salary. Like that was obvious they eventually used a trade exception to help build up post Clay, but the Lakers efforted there. Like they efforted for DeMar DeRozan, another guy that honestly, I'm not sure I like DeMar as a player. I did not love the fit for him with the Lakers. I definitely didn't love the contract that would have been required. Jonas Valanciunas, from his perspective, I think just from his perspective in terms of the role, like if he's choosing, I know the Wizards are a crappy tire fire island of misfit toys, but his particular role, he's going to get more minutes and it's going to be more defined with the Wizards than on a team with AD, who's going to be playing the bulk of his minutes at center. So from Valanciunas, and I'm sure Valanciunas does not expect to finish those 3 years in DC. I imagine he knows he's going to be moved at some point because he really doesn't make sense for them long term. But Gary Trent Jr., for example, put aside the Lakers, 15 guaranteed roster spots. They could have found a way to sign Gary Trent if they wanted to. I mean, there's no rule that says even though they have 15, they can't add a 16th guaranteed. Like it just becomes a question of who you eventually cut or move or whatever. But from Trent's perspective, the opportunities are better for him in Milwaukee, I think, as far as playing time and role than they would be with the Lakers. And that, I think, speaks to the other tricky part of this for Rob Pelinka is if you look at some of the players on the Lakers that are considered the most either tradable contracts or the contracts that are of a certain monetary value, where you can bring back an impact player in return. D'Angelo Russell, Rui Hachimura, Jared Vanderbilt, Austin Reeves, if you want to even consider him in this equation. There have been reports that the Lakers are extremely reluctant to trade him, and that's the sense I get as well. Those are top 6 guys on the team. So they're not expendable. Like you have to make sure that if you move them, that you're getting better in the process, because it makes no sense to send them out likely with a pick attached to them in what's like a lateral move. Like that's something that might get fans excited and it might feel like you're doing something. I do not want the Lakers to make performative moves right now. Like I get the idea that there's urgency with LeBron at 40, and that urgency is real if you are trying to cash in as much as possible for the remainder of his time with the Lakers and him still playing at a really high level. But the urgency doesn't make the move better than it actually is. And especially, too, I think what makes this tricky is the Lakers have very real regular season considerations in a really difficult Western Conference where they got to keep the pace with a bunch of really good teams, which means I know Laker fans and the franchise often likes to talk about nothing matters other than the playoffs, but the regular season puts you in the best position possible to actually make the playoffs, but B, make the playoffs with the best seed possible, which means you need to win regular season games. Say whatever you want about the issues that have come up at times for D'Angelo Russell in the playoffs. D'Lo's really important to them for the regular season. Like last year, they don't make the playoffs without D'Lo. Flat out, they don't. So like moving him, for example, for somebody like Dorian Finney-Smith, who I've seen come up a lot, in the playoffs, maybe there is more utility for Dorian Finney-Smith or certain matchups, like his floor may be higher than D'Lo's, but D'Lo's ceiling will help them more in the regular season. So I think especially when you take into account how much they're trying to take off LeBron's plate over 82 games, there's a certain amount of counting numbers that are necessary along the roster and production. And that's what I think makes this tricky for Rob Pelinka.
And as I've talked about on here, and I saw it got picked up a couple places. Like from my sense coming out of Vegas and just talking to people around the league, talking to people with the Lakers, like most of those contracts that you were talking about have neutral to negative value to a lot of teams, and I think there's a bit of a gap there between how the Lakers view some of those guys internally, or just how they value them, versus how the rest of the league views them. Like, my sense is I think a lot of people view Rui and Vando as like backup guys, not starting level guys. And I think they've shown with the Lakers that they can be starting level guys. And I think the Lakers look at them as that like fit starter type. But like it's been a lot of these conversations end up going into like maybe a team likes one of the few tradable guys, but they don't like all of them. And then in a lot, like in any substantive, if you're going for, let's say, a Jerami Grant, you need to trade at least a couple of those guys. And it's been difficult to, kind of find that common ground with the players, let alone then it's like, well, if I'm going to take on, player X, well, I want a first round pick for that, in addition to wanting a first round pick for a Jerami Grant. So that's where it's just gotten tricky for the Lakers. The one thing that I personally like just don't get is the lack of a consolidation trade. And even if it is just like dumping a couple of guys to have that roster flexibility, you do have to get back up to 14. But like Gary Trent, okay, he's playing for like he miscalculated his market and the type of contract that he was going to get. So like going to Milwaukee makes sense. He's going to be a starter. He's going to play a certain amount of minutes. And like, okay, so picking Milwaukee over the Lakers, even though the Lakers technically, if they traded a couple of these guys, could have created enough money to unlock the taxpayer MLE and get 5.2 million ish, depending on how much which guys are going out. So they could have technically offered more money if they were able to do that. But I get like from a role perspective, Gary Trent is probably going to increase his value playing in Milwaukee around Giannis and Dame. And okay, so that makes sense. But I look at a guy like Spencer Dinwiddie as if you are the Lakers and you're potentially doing a D'Lo trade at some point, as they have been shopping him and trying to move him since he opted in. It's like, well, it would be nice to have a player of Spencer Dinwiddie's caliber on your roster, where if you do flip D'Lo and it is for a big man and a wing or one of those two positions, and you're not replacing a point guard, like is Gabe Vincent and Spencer Dinwiddie the best point guard rotation in the West? Like, no, but it's better than the alternative of like just Gabe Vincent and then now potentially relying on Jalen Hood-Schifino or trying to scramble on the buyout market for like a 34-year-old like backup point guard. So I think like kind of like just looking down the road of, okay, if we're trying to address like the wing spot and the center spot, we might eventually have to move D'Lo and have a hole here at point guard. Well, it would be nice to go out and get a playable point guard. And I just look at like, I think they have too many unplayable guys or just guys that you don't want to have to play at the back end of the roster. And even if it's as simple as like, trade a Cam Reddish and a Christian Wood, Cam Reddish and Jackson Hayes, whatever your preference is, and dump even one or even 2 second-round picks. Like, it's going to cost something. Yeah, it's not free. But I just look at like I don't think the back. Like again, I think the top 9 makes a lot of sense, and I think there's plenty of shooting and defense and versatility around LeBron and AD. But 10 to 15. I have some significant concerns with in terms of like playoff viability and even regular season viability. Yeah. And if you don't like, yes, wait it, like there's not necessarily urgency to make one of those moves, especially now that Dinwiddie's gone, Gary Trent's gone. Like there aren't many impact caliber minimum guys, but I think sometimes like they've been over the last few years, they've been a little too cautious in general, but also a little too hesitant to fix their mistakes. And it was like the Russ situation. They wanted to then try and make it work. And then they tried to frame, well, let's bring in a new coach to try and make this work. And then, let's handle it this way. And then let's wait until the deadline. And like, it ended up working out where they made the conference finals, but like still, I mean, I think there's an alternate universe where they make a trade before that season and they win 50 plus games and like they still make the conference finals and they just have a better season, not having Russ on the team and just the hole they got into. And it feels like they're kind of in a similar boat now where like they're sort of like almost being a little stubborn in terms of like righting some of the wrongs of the previous roster of like, okay, you gave out these player options that you shouldn't have given out. It is what it is, but like correct the mistake. Don't just, kind of pretend like it's not there. And that's kind of what it feels like they're doing right now of like not addressing that. And maybe they address it before the season. Maybe they address it at some point during the season. and that's fine. And like, depending on who they add, I can like, maybe it works out, right? I'm not saying it's not going to work out. I just think there was a scenario in which they could have dumped a Cam Reddish and a Christian Wood on one of these teams with cap space or one of these teams with some financial flexibility. And if you went and signed a Spencer Dinwiddie or even just another solid minimum guy that's better than those guys, I just think like there's no real reason to like not do that. So that's the one where like the trades and giving up the first round picks, like that's a bit more of a nuanced conversation. But improving the back end of this roster, which in my opinion is pretty bad, I just don't see an argument against that. And to me, it just doesn't make sense why they haven't done that.
Well, I definitely think there's no argument against doing it. I don't think they necessarily have to do it now, just because it's unfortunately it is still July, but it is nonetheless still July, and I feel like they've got time. I don't feel like they've necessarily missed out. I mean, like Spencer Dinwiddie, for example. Like, first of all, from his perspective, I'm not joining this team until I know D'Angelo Russell's gone. Like, from his perspective, I just wouldn't do it. And I'm not going to feel comfortable. I'm not going to personally feel comfortable if I'm the Lakers with Dinwiddie as my potential replacement for D'Angelo Russell, because I think D'Lo's better than Spencer. I think.
I mean, he is for sure.
Yeah, and
it's more so just like I think the alternative unless you're getting a guard back, which maybe they do get a
to
guard
me,
back.
if you trade D'Lo, unless you are just getting the mother of two-way wings for this roster, like you need to essentially be trading D'Lo for an upgrade over D'Lo, because they need over 82 games the stuff that D'Lo does. Like D'Lo, he's got flaws. I think sometimes the flaws are overblown, but they're definitely real. But he's a really good offensive player. He is, unless you're going to count LeBron just because, LeBron is whatever he wants to be on offense, he's the best point guard on this team by a long shot. Like, even if you think Austin Reeves is a better overall player than D'Lo is a better point guard than Reeves. Like, he's a better playmaker and facilitator and floor general than Reeves is. I think D'Lo is the best guy on this team at finding AD. Like, I think he looks for AD more consistently, more than they track passes. He actually passes the ball to AD more than anybody else on the team. They do need to make moves, and you're correct. Like, there are 4 or 5 players on this team that you're not comfortable with them getting regular minutes at all. I do understand the reluctance to, or I guess maybe the urge to wait it out as long as you possibly can, just to see if maybe it only requires 1 second versus 2, just because you might need that second for another deal. Like, part of what makes this, I think, difficult for the Lakers is they're so asset poor right now. Like, you talked before about the potential negative or neutral value of D'Lo or Vando or Rui. If that's the case, then every second round pick that they have in the kitty may be the difference between being able to move one of those guys or not. So it becomes, I think, they may have to, just as a cost of doing business, attach some seconds to create space, by offloading Cam, offloading Wood. They may also ultimately decide that it's better just to do a stretch and wave with one of them, and keep those seconds. And they're just waiting out to see how long it takes. And, there is a logic to it. Like, you only get to trade these picks once. You only get the opportunity to fix your mistakes so many times. And like, in that period before they eventually moved Russ, other than Miles Turner, who if it were truly possible to have made that deal with Indiana, I would have done it.
It was.
There's nobody that was attached to, or linked to the Lakers in rumors specifically involving Russ that I think was better than they ultimately did. Like, Miles Turner, I think, is the best player that was linked to them. But otherwise, like, I remember in the first season of Russ where, it was clear from the beginning this was not going to work. There had been reports that LeBron and AD wanted them to, this is in Russ's first season, move move Russ for John Wall and Christian Wood, and it would have required attaching picks. Like, that would have been insane. Like, that would have been an absolutely horrible move. And I remember, I think like Rich Paul had to end up walking back those reports or refuting them or whatever. But like, I don't care how mad LeBron was or how mad AD was or how badly they wanted it. That's a terrible, terrible decision. And like, sometimes you have to wait out your bad situation because the alternative, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And it sucks. Like, it sucks being in that period where it feels like you are frittering away LeBron and AD, this tandem, and you know, them playing still at a really high level, but the move still has to make sense. Like, it still has to justify itself. And to me, LeBron is pushing 40. That's not an automatic justification. Like, the move still has to justify itself. Like, because the unfortunate truth may be that the window got shut by the Russ deal. Like, I'm hoping that's not the case. And the window is not shut for them to be a great team and, you know, to still be very competitive, you know, make a playoff run, stuff like that. But like, to be a front running contender, that window just may be shut. And it sucks. And the Lakers should try to fight against it as best they can. But if the moves they are going to make, they know deep down, really don't get them that much closer. But it's just about getting fans off their asses or getting LeBron and AD off their asses. Like, it's, to me, it's not a good enough justification, because then you're still left with a move that didn't work. You're lacking assets to try to maybe find down the road a better move that would have been better for you. Like, it's a bad situation to be in, but they only have so many metaphorical bullets left to fire. So they got to be really selective when they do.
I guess the only counterpoint I have, and I'm specifically talking about like the back end stuff, is that you know, so you have a couple of teams in Utah and Detroit that currently have cap space, but will eventually have to spend that cap space.
Yeah.
And whether that be, you know, bigger trades or signing guys to bigger deals just to kind of get to a certain level financially, like that cap space will have to be taken up. Also, as you mentioned, like you have these lack of roster spot restrictions during the offseason, but eventually it's going to be, you can't have more than 15 players on your roster. So once you get into the actual season, like doing these trades, it's not just as simple as, well, here's Christian Wood and Cam Reddish. Let's, you know, put them on your 14 or 15 man roster and expand that to 16 or 17. It's like, now we or you have to send out something to us, and you know, now you have, like, you got to do matching salary, and so I think, like, I mean, again, like the window to kind of do a salary dump, depending on what happens with those teams and their roster spots and their cap sheets, can get a little trickier during the season.
Let me ask you something.
And there's a chance that the price even gets higher, where it's like, okay, well, now we have to send out like this young player that we don't love, but we kind of like, just to kind of match it up. And for that, okay, well, we want a second round pick or a third second round pick. So like, I think there's a lot of, like, I agree to an extent with what you're saying. I just also think there's a potential downside to waiting to kind of figure this out, where there is more flexibility with teams in the offseason to execute these moves. And if you just say, because also, like, Utah has the Lauri Markkanen situation, where
I was just about to
is
ask
kick
you that.
in. Yeah,
like your colleague over at The Athletic, my former colleague at ESPN, John Hollinger, had a piece like a few weeks ago about how he thinks one reason that it is just really quiet across the league, period, is that teams around the league are waiting out the Lauri Markkanen situation. And basically August 6th is like the first day, the first day that Utah can sign Markkanen to that extension, but also it's the only day that they could do it where he would still be trade eligible for the season. So like August 6th becomes this marker date on the calendar. And what got me thinking about that is, you mentioned like Utah having that extra space available on the roster, but maybe a factor that's complicating things for the Lakers is Utah doesn't want to do anything with that space potentially until they know what's going on in their own house with Markkanen. You know, I'm sure there are teams around the league, Hollinger mentioned this as well, waiting out what's going on with New Orleans and Brandon Ingram, which Who knows how connected that could be to Lauri Markkanen? And like the Lakers are, I'm just going to say it now. The Lakers are not going to be in the Markkanen sweepstakes because I cannot imagine
Correct,
a world
yes.
where they outbid everyone else, but they could be tangentially connected to it as like either a third team, or the trickle down from the original trade affects some of the moves they can make. Like, I wonder if some of what feels like them being dormant is just like the rest of the league is just like, we're not doing anything either because we're all waiting out this thing.
It's certainly possible. I mean, it's been a factor, and I've talked about it before. And Brandon Ingram is another one where he's a smaller domino, but he is still a domino that could have a ripple effect. So, like, I mean, we saw, another thing that I heard when I was in Vegas is just like they probably kind of missed. If they were going to do something, it probably had to be like a little bit earlier in the timeline. And now that they waited, it became this, because you look at like Detroit in the Tim Hardaway situation, like the Lakers could have done, albeit, it's less. I don't think they would have sent out like a Gabe or just kind of like dumped an actual rotation guy, but you could have done Cam Reddish and Christian Wood then with a second round pick or whatever to Detroit and just dump them on them, and then that situation is settled, and all of a sudden you have both financial flexibility to sign another player, but also just to be because right now they're 45,000 under the second apron, so like just it gets tricky. Where also, I mean, if let's just say they had added a Spencer Dinwiddie or a Gary Trent Jr. as the 16th guy, like now you are technically with your sign. I mean, like you now have to shed a contract at some point, and teams know you are technically above the second apron. And it's not kicking in necessarily yet, but like you almost lose leverage there where it's like you have to make a move. Otherwise you have these penalties and you just can't have 16 guaranteed contracts on your roster anyway.
The Lakers could really use a mid-sized salary that is totally expendable. Like that's part of the problem they have too, is none of their trades at that, none of their salaries at that, between say like Gabe to D'Lo, Gabe's around 11 million, D'Lo's around, I think 18 million, something like that. None of those players are wholly expendable. Like last year, Dallas, when they moved the guys for Gafford and PJ Washington, it was Rashawn Holmes and Seth Curry and Grant Williams, correct?
Yeah.
Those guys were all out. Those guys were all out of the rotation for Dallas. Like the picks that they attached to those guys mattered to Dallas, but the players themselves didn't matter at all. And that's why they were able to seemingly just add to their rotation and go for it in a way that, say, the Lakers didn't. The Lakers didn't really have players like that. And it, in a weird, perverse way, it would really help if Christian Wood was making like $12 to $13 million as a guy that you don't want to play. Like in certain ways, it would make him more valuable to the Lakers. Or if Jackson Hayes made $13 million a year, or Cam Reddish, who, by the way, no longer with Clutch. Like, really, Cam?
Yeah.
He just joined Wasserman.
Really?
Really? Like,
well,
really?
Now he's expendable.
I'm just saying, it's like, really?
Yeah.
You couldn't have done this 2 years ago, really? But like, if those guys were making like $10 to $13 million a year, they would actually be much more useful for the Lakers as tradable contracts, even bloated, than as minimum contracts. Like the back of the rotation guys are truly useless for the Lakers in that you don't want to put them on the floor, and they have no value as tradable contracts.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess the closest guy like maybe is Gabe, because he's not in that top six. He's probably number 7. And like, I guess depending on what happens with Max Christie in terms of his development, and then Dalton Connect and how ready he is, like maybe there's a scenario in which Gabe is like their 9th best player. And then even if we get into like, Jackson or Christian kind of being valuable as like the backup 5, like maybe Gabe is like the 10th or 11th guy. And then all of a sudden you could talk yourself into like, because I look at and I believe the finances work, although it's close because the Lakers can't. They might have to throw in an extra, but like basically like Rui and Gabe works for Jerami Grant, and I think you have to throw in one more contract. But obviously with Portland now, then they're taking on a couple guys, and it gets tricky for them to kind of figure out their roster situation. But like from just a Lakers perspective, like Rui and Gabe works for Jerami Grant, and to me that's like, okay, now you slot in Jerami Grant as your starting 3 or 4. Vando moves to the bench, and you have this now kind of clear, like you are losing some depth, and you are losing like a rotation spot, but I think the potential upgrade from a Rui to a Jerami Grant is worth it. Now, when we get into the Dorian Finney-Smiths and the Cam Johnsons, that's not as much of an upgrade, if an upgrade at all, depending on how you look at it. Kyle Kuzma is kind of also an in-between one, where I think he's better than those guys, but not quite at the level of a Jerami Grant. Bruce Brown, it's sort of like, which Bruce Brown do you believe in?
Right.
The Denver Bruce Brown or the Indiana/Toronto Bruce Brown? And then Wendell Carter, like, can he stay healthy? And how much can you actually play a 5 next to AD? That's a big one. So
yeah, let me run something past you that I've been thinking about a lot. And I think this also speaks to the difficulties for Rob Pelinka, which, by the way, are not sympathies for Rob Pelinka. This is your job. Figure it out. But trickiness is still trickiness. AD and LeBron, I think, still play off each other very well. And in a vacuum, like just as a tandem, they're still really, really good together. I think you can make an argument they are still the best 1-2 punch in the league, particularly once you get to the part of the season where LeBron is truly selling out and is truly energized on both sides of the ball. But building around them, I don't think is nearly as easy as it was when they first started playing together, when LeBron was really more like a 0.4. Offensively, LeBron's always whatever you want, but he operated like a small forward defensively, and you could see them more as like wing big, or even like guard/wing big. Now, offensively, AD has not had the gravity that he ever had in that one season. His jumper, I don't think, is necessarily as bad as some people make it out to be, but it's not in space reliable the way it used to be. So there's been a certain amount of water seeking out its own level offensively, and certain spacing issues that come with AD now offensively. And then especially defensively, I think there's much more redundancy now between LeBron and AD. Like, defensively, over the course of 82 games, other than maybe select moments down the stretch of high leverage games, LeBron is more ideally a small ball 5 defensively, I think, than a 3 at this stage of his career. And obviously, Anthony Davis has got the center thing defensively all locked up pretty nicely. Thank you. So I think it makes it now harder actually to build around them than it used to be. Like, again, they're still great in a vacuum together, but I think putting the pieces around them is much harder going into 24-25 than it was going into 2019-2020.
Yeah, it is tricky, and that's where I think you need that like big wing with a certain level. Ideally, you have a wing who can do some of the things that LeBron isn't going to necessarily do for the first 50, 60 games.
Can Jerami Grant still defend threes? That's the question, the biggest open question I have about him. Can he still
talking to some people in Portland, they think so, but and they think with a reduced offensive role, he can ramp up the defense again and really lock into that. And that's where I think the thing I like most about Jerami Grant is I think he could play the 3 or the 4. He theoretically can. I don't think he's quite the same level as defender as he was a few years ago before he broke out in Detroit. As he wanted to take that step as. He proved he can be a number 1 or number 2 option. Now that team's probably going to be pretty bad, but he can
still number 1 though. Still number 1, baby.
So but if you slot him in as the number 3 or number 4 guy on this roster, and you have these I can imagine he gets the second unit reps of you're going to be the guy with we're going to have these second unit shifts where for 3 to 5, 3 to 6 minutes, whatever, a half, you are the guy and we're running the offense through you. And it's just like you're in Detroit or Portland again, and you're showing your bag and all that stuff. Like, but then there's going to be the shifts where you're next to LeBron or AD and they're the number one option. The shifts you're next to both and you're the number three option, and even some shifts of depending on, I mean, you could keep D'Lo potentially in this, theoretical trade. So like, maybe D'Lo's the third option, or maybe Austin's feeling it and he's the third option. So like, I think like in a way, when we're talking about the strengths of like, comparing Rui versus Vando, I kind of feel like Jerami Grant checks both boxes where he brings a lot of what Rui could do. He's not as like physically strong or imposing, but he's just as good of like both guys aren't great. I mean, are subpar rebounders probably for their size. But like he does bring that Rui ability to, if he's the fourth or fifth option in a lineup, he's going to destroy whoever is that like third front court guy or like smaller wing guy on him. Like he's going to dominate that. But then he also can do some of the Vando stuff of like the defense, not quite at that level, but can defend, can take on the assignments. And like, I just think it's like the sweet spot there. So Jerami Grant is like the one guy. Kuzma, not as good defensively, is a bit more of like,
not as good of a
Jerami Grant shot. Yeah, Jerami Grant shot 40% on threes the last 2 seasons. He's been a better like off-ball guy than I think he's given credit for. So like Kuzma, I think he needs the ball a little bit more. He's developed some bad habits in Washington. I think he could, like, if he's willing to
They've
take
all
the back
developed
seat.
bad habits in Washington, to be fair.
It's the bad habit capital right now of the NBA. But
name the guy who hasn't. Like it's gonna be 2 weeks, and Valanciunas gonna be like, wait, how did this guy become this guy? Like when did
he could put up, I mean, Valanciunas could be like an 18 and 10 guy in Washington, but like again, they're gonna be pretty bad. But like I guess point being, like Jerami Grant is the one guy I look at where as I've reported and others have reported, like Portland's been wanting 2 first-round picks for Jerami Grant, and that is a steep price for the Lakers. But to me, he might be the one guy, especially if you can keep D'Lo, and then you have that optionality of like you don't have the first to trade in a potential D'Lo trade, but like you could do a separate move. Maybe you do a couple swaps or a swap in like a couple seconds or something. And D'Lo will have more value closer to the trade deadline because he'll be an expiring contract with a couple months left. So I think like you still have the optionality to do a second move. It's going to be a little bit trickier, but Jerami Grant's like the one guy where looking at all the options, if he is willing to buy into being the number 3 or number 4 guy, and he is willing to take on, like, you are going to be our wing stopper and we need this from you 30 to 35 minutes a night. Depending on if you could keep Vando, like, okay, we'll run some shifts with Vando where he'll be that guy and you'll be like the second guy, or Max will be that guy and you'll be the second guy. But like, we need you to lean into this and go back to being the guy you were like 4 years ago with the occasional shifts of like the offense. I think that guy can really elevate this team and give them a blend of what Rui and Vando have. But outside of that, the other options aren't as compelling to me. And then Wendell Carter, I really like. I just think that's also going to be a really expensive trade that potentially costs you 2 picks. And it's just like,
I'm not doing 2 picks
with AD as a 5
backup center.
Yeah,
like,
it's just and his injury history. He's missed 20 plus games every season, multiple seasons with 30 plus games. So like, that's concerning.
One last thought to me on Jerami Grant, because we were talking about what could come next for a D'Lo trade if you secure Jerami Grant, even though you don't have the first, whatever. If Jerami Grant really is that sweet spot between Rui and Vando with the offensive and defensive combination, and Jerami Grant really can be a guy that can at least credibly guard the wings that you don't want LeBron having to do, or gives you, maybe not at the exact same level, but some of that defensive versatility that Vando gives you. At that point, I wonder if maybe you don't even have to trade D'Lo at all, because we saw during the 2023 playoffs, D'Lo's playoff history is real, and some of those limitations and some of those bad games are real. But I think people forget he's also had some really good playoff games, like with the Lakers. It's not like every single round, every single game has been a disaster. It's just when it's been bad, it's been really bad. And some of the limitations that D'Lo has athletically, defensively, whatever, they become really pronounced in the playoffs. But we also saw in the first 2 rounds against Memphis and then against Golden State, D'Lo was far more good than bad, and the defensive issues weren't nearly as pronounced because you had Jared Vanderbilt out there as an option. If Jerami Grant does that, then maybe you end up in a position where keeping D'Lo actually becomes the best move. And then if he leaves in the offseason, he leaves in the offseason. But in the meantime, you get the stuff that's actually good from D'Lo in ways that you can keep the floor from lowering as much. Just because, again, like Vando did help provide a proof of concept where Reeves and D'Lo as a backcourt can work despite the defensive issues, because offensively in a vacuum, the two of them play really well off each other. They actually are a good fit offensively together. Yeah. It's just the defense has been an issue.
And I think also with Jerami Grant, and he's obviously a better offensive player than Rui, and has, as we said, shown he can be like that number 1 or number 2 guy on a bad team. But if he's being that number 3 or number 4 guy, like let's just say D'Lo, I feel like with D'Lo, you can kind of tell in the first quarter of a playoff game, like which D'Lo you're getting that night. And if it is one of the bad D'Lo nights, then you can go with a Max Christie or a Dalton Connect in that fit spot, or you could even go with Vando in that fit spot. And in this scenario, Rui and Gabe plus JHS or minimum guy or whatever went to Portland. So like in this scenario, you don't have Gabe anymore. So you don't have like the Dennis replacement, like, cause like Dennis was very valuable just for that. If D'Lo isn't playing well, you can at least rely on Dennis to kind of fill that gap. So you don't have like that player technically. And this is where it would be nice if you had, like, let's say Spencer Dinwiddie instead of Cam Reddish, but I digress. But you could go with like, I would love to see a Max Austin backcourt. And I think with LeBron ramping up his usage in the playoffs, and then Jerami Grant also having a certain level of shot creation, like you don't necessarily need to rely on D'Lo as much. Right. And we've also seen Austin has been able to, like I felt like Austin became more of the third option progressively in that Denver series with D'Lo kind of struggling. So like you could rely on Austin more. You could rely on LeBron and AD more as you should.
Also allow for the possibility. You also allow for the possibility of, like, I think it was game 2 against Denver. The Lakers lost, but D'Lo had a great game. Like,
yeah. I mean, so like,
or like the play-in game,
it gives you optionality.
The play-in game against New Orleans, like D'Lo was the best Laker in that game. Like I don't think they win that game without D'Lo. So like,
yeah. So I think to your point, I think you don't necessarily have to trade him. Now I think the one hole in the roster in that scenario still remains the backup center spot. But you can go a different route. And maybe if you are like, maybe they can find a cheap center, could they go out and get a Day'Ron Sharp? And if you are putting a Christian Wood or a Jackson Hayes on the table with a second or maybe a couple seconds, at least probably you're getting something back.
Probably a couple.
Probably a couple at least. But at least now you don't have you can't even have the first held against you because you're like, hey, we traded both firsts. And Jerami Grant, like the one thing I think we need to address with this is like his contract is not good. And that's like the Laker pushback is like the Portland pushback is, well, leverage and he's going to be your number 3 or number 4 guy, and like he checks these boxes for you, but like the contract is not good, and that's where I think, like, honestly the fairest thing is probably 1 first. Especially if you're not, because I've heard Portland doesn't want D'Lo because they have a million guards anyway, so like just doesn't really make sense for them. So if you're keeping D'Lo out, and of course the Lakers would rather keep D'Lo out in this configuration, like it just, I think like 1 first makes the most sense. If Portland really wants to push the leverage, like, I mean, maybe you could do like a protected first or like, top 15 lottery protected, whatever. But I think it I don't know. That to me is the one that makes the most sense. But I will say, like, the Grant contract is concerning longer term. I just also think if you're trying to go like, let's try and win with LeBron and AD the next 2 years, like that as of now looks like the best realistic option.
For me, the contract is not good, as you said, and it goes on like forever.
I think it's 4 more years.
Yes, it goes on a while. I would really, especially if it turns out like you have to surrender 2 first, maybe one of them as protections or whatever, but like, or swaps, but either way, you are giving up control of your picks moving forward. I would really want to have a pretty rock solid idea that the defensive versatility for Grant has not gone away with age. Like, I'm not talking about disinterest in Portland, because I don't blame him if he checked out at a certain point and it's been a mess. But like, I need to know that he can still do it. Like, you know, because he used to
He's
be.
he's 30, right? I want to say.
I will look it up now. He's in his 30s.
He's 30. I
Um,
want to say he's 30 or 31, but I want to say he's 30.
he
Maybe he's turning 31
is.
next season.
He is turning 31 during the season, and so that contract goes on a while. I would just need to know, like, 'cause he used to be a really versatile defender who could do a lot of different things. Can he still do that when engaged, or is age taking it away? Because if age has taken it away, A, I'm not sure he becomes nearly as good of a target as you might have thought of, but B, I don't want that contract on my books forever and have to surrender 2 picks and depth in the process. I don't know if they become good enough where it's worth it.
For me, I kind of look at it as like, barring the Lakers pulling a rabbit out of the hat with like a superstar joining, when like let's just say LeBron retires in 2 years, so he retires. He plays 23 seasons, which I think would be a bit poetic, and most seasons of all time, but also his most common jersey number. So plays 23 seasons, retires. So this is now 2025, 2026. So like the Lakers all of a sudden have $50+ million off the cap sheet. And I want to say you'll have Gabe coming off, Rui coming off. So you're going to have some flexibility in terms of like potentially adding a star. At the same time, we've also seen that stars don't move the same way in free agency unless it unceremoniously ends, like Paul George with Philly. So like maybe the Lakers could get someone in 2026, but I also think there's a scenario in which like LeBron retires and they have like this 1 to 2 year dip. And if Jerami Grant is on your roster and it's something like AD, Jerami Grant, Austin, maybe D'Lo's still a Laker, like
Dalton Connect.
It's not like a contender, but at least it's like a, yeah. I mean, okay, I'm like they're not going to be good, right? But or at least like they're not a contender. But I just think it's you're probably going to have this 1 to 2 year gap with LeBron retiring anyway, where I don't know how much it matters. Like in an ideal world, if you can add someone in free agency, obviously you'd rather have that flexibility. But I feel like there might be that dip anyway, and it might just be like, what's the next era of Lakers basketball look like? We need like a year or two to figure that out. At which point Grant is now coming off your books, and if you don't make some bad signings or trades in that summer, you will have the flexibility come 2027, 2028 to then go get that next star. So I don't like, ideally Grant doesn't have the contract that he has, but I feel like among the options, I still think it's the best one.
Well, you took me somewhere a little bit roundabout, but it's something that I've emphasized on Locked On Lakers before and on Twitter at Cam Brothers in the past. Like, for all of the focus, and it reminded me of this just because at this point you're talking about what would be the back end of Anthony Davis's career, or excuse me, the back end of his prime. And for all of the focus on maximizing LeBron's turning 40. Like, we got to do this while we have LeBron. I actually think the guy you need to think about more is Anthony Davis, because AD is actually the guy in his prime. And AD is actually the guy that is still a two-way force in the league. Like, I would argue last year, nobody in the league carried more of a two-way load at a higher level with more urgency and higher stakes games, like, being part of a team that was looking to make a playoff run, than Anthony Davis. Like, I don't think anybody in the league, certainly not definitively, did it more than AD. And he's still in the middle of his prime. So I personally feel like, and probably should have mentioned it earlier on, but like, for all the talk about LeBron, if you're not thinking of this through the prism of Anthony Davis, if you're Rob Pelinka, if you're Jeannie Buss, if you're not thinking about this first through the prism of AD, what are AD's needs? What are the things AD needs moving forward? I actually think you're doing this wrong.
the point we're getting at with like this whole entire kind of conversation is like they are in this just like weird spot where if like I don't think they're good enough to win a championship as currently constructed with how deep the top of the West is and how deep the top of the East is. Like I think I'm on the optimistic side with the Lakers. Like I think they probably have the fifth most upside in the West, in my opinion. Now, given injuries and some of the age concerns with LeBron and AD, like they still probably end up being maybe like a 7 seed or something, just because those guys will probably miss at least 10 to 15 games, if not more, based on how the last few years have gone. But I still like put them against like almost anyone in the West, and I feel like they have a good chance to make that a competitive series, if not win that series. But even then, when you look at the top of the West, top of the East, like if I'm power ranking, I still might only have the Lakers at like 8 or 9. And that's higher than I think a lot of people would have them. So like you still have that gap there of like, I think they're better than people think they are, but they're not quite at the level to maximize this group around LeBron and AD. And they probably have to make a move or two. But the problem is you're almost going to have to give up at least one of the picks, if not both, and potentially take on a contract that you don't love. And it's just like, you have all these things you're calculating that it's tough to find like the guy who checks the boxes, who also doesn't have a bad contract, who also doesn't require both picks. Like that almost doesn't exist. You're going to have to lose one of those things, if not a couple of them. And it's they're in a tough spot.
I don't mind the losing the stuff part of it. To me, what matters is it worth it? Like, are you getting better enough to justify doing this stuff? Because again, you might even need some of that stuff in the back end of AD's prime. Like, I think you need to be thinking about it too. Like, okay, when AD's 32, 33, if he's still playing at a high level, are you going to be able to maximize that? Because as far as this configuration with LeBron and AD, unfortunately, you have to at least be considering the idea of, did we miss that window? And if we did miss that window, it doesn't mean that you don't try to fix it as well as you can, but you have to be honest about, are we in a box where there's only so much better we can make ourselves because of points A through Z? And in the meantime, are we going to try to overcorrect this in a way where we don't get to where we want, but then all of a sudden we're left with AD at the back end of his prime and we can't do anything for him either? And then, do you trade AD, but then you're trading him the back end of his prime where he doesn't have as much value? So again, I think they need to be thinking about this as much through the prism, frankly, more through the prism of AD than LeBron. The natural inclination is always going to be LeBron because he's LeBron, and his stature and the fact that he's still doing this at this age becomes a storyline in itself that creates urgency, and I get it. But I really do think they need to be thinking about this more through AD and not LeBron.
I think that is a good point to end this on. We found a way to go an hour basically with not much to talk about. But
Jovan, this is how the G's do it, man.
Yeah,
that's how they do it.
We did it. We didn't hit on everything, but I really like the direction of this conversation. And I thought it was very interesting. And these are the conversations the Lakers are having internally and trying to figure out over the next, as you pointed out, like could be next couple of weeks once the Lauri Markkanen situation is resolved, or it could be next couple months or even into the season and the trade deadline. So Andy, for those who do not follow you or aren't watching yet, first off, you should be following him at Cam Brothers and check out Locked On Lakers and either listen to it on audio form or on YouTube. But anything else you want to plug before we get out of here?
Depending on when you hear this show, if it's Friday, I'm going to be on 710 ESPN from 1 to 4 p.m. Pacific with Ramona Shelburne doing Mason in Ireland. And then the following week on Monday, I will be on 710 ESPN from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific with Travis Rogers. And then on Wednesday from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific time with DeMarco Farr. So I will be all over 710 ESPN for the next several days, different voices, a lot of fun.
Well, make sure you check out Andy on 710 ESPN and does great work. And I've been, at this point, we've known each other, 13 years, something like that.
Something
13,
like that,
14
man.
years. It's been
a while.
You were it's been a while, and I've learned a lot from directly and indirectly, just observing.
Now you're just aging me, Jovan. Thank you.
No, I'm giving you your flowers, but
I
I appreciate the time, and I appreciate the home and home. Make sure you check out our episode on Lockdown Lakers. That'll be coming out Friday, I want to say.
Yeah, it'll be out Friday.
It'll be out Friday.
Thursday night, technically on the YouTube. It will be out probably around 10:15 Pacific time, PM.
Cool. And then thank you all for watching, listening. And for those watching on YouTube, please be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, like this video, and drop a comment. For those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I'll be back on Monday with a special guest. I'm teasing it. I think people are going to enjoy this one. It is not. I don't use the double special very often, so be on the lookout for that interview. You're special triple. But thank you so much again for watching and listening, and I will talk to you soon.